You're listening to episode 13 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Today we are joined by Dr. Sara Lazar and Dr. David R. Vago, two of the authors of the new position paper, Moving Beyond Mindfulness, defining equanimity as an outcome measure in meditation and contemplative research. We frequently hear that mindfulness is the practice of intentionally inviting our attention to experiencing the present moment with open inquiry without judgment. As we sit in meditation, we notice and return again and again back to the rich experience of right now, whatever it may contain. And sometimes we stumble as we judge ourselves for not being mindful, conflating the practice of returning our attention with a goal, an idea about an outcome we're expecting and adhering to. But that begs the question, what is the outcome of mindfulness, the practice? And if we can discern what might grow from our non-striving, how can we measure it for ourselves and others? Mindfulness interventions have their roots in a religious tradition, but are not dependent on it for further exploration and growth. As we can and do learn from that tradition, we have a difficult path to walk in opening our minds to new possibilities while not attaching to old ideological stances. The study of contemplative practices with scientific rigor is still in its infancy, and we're seeing a bridging of the gap of what works, what doesn't, and what we bring with us into the future. Part of that is what we mean by mindfulness at all, and what the possible outcomes may be. Researchers who are also practitioners investigate what the tradition says and contextualize it for further contemporary study. Sara Lazar got her PhD from Harvard University in 1996. She is currently an instructor in psychiatry at Harvard, is a scientist with the Mind-Body Medical Institute at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and is part of the Psychiatric Neuroimaging Research Program at Massachusetts General Hospital. She is an active Kripalo yogini and has been practicing Vipassana meditation since 1997. David Vago is an instructor of psychology in the Functional Neuroimaging Laboratory, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He has completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Psychiatry at BWH, the Stuart T. Hauser Research Training Program in Biological and Social Psychiatry, and at the Utah Center for Mind-Body Interactions within the University of Utah's Medical School. He received his bachelor's degree in Brain and Cognitive Sciences in 1997 from the University of Rochester. In 2005, David received his PhD in Cognitive and Neurosciences with a specialization in learning and memory from the Department of Psychology, University of Utah. Our guests today are Dr. Sara Lazar. Sara, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And Dr. David Vago. Dave, thank you for being here on Present Moment as well.
Wonderful to be here, Ted.
So you're part of a group that has written a position paper on equanimity. So what was the situation that led to an interest in writing it, and what's the paper about? Sara, let's start with you.
Right. Our group was talking a lot about mindfulness and how to measure it and what the goal of meditation practice is and how we would go about measuring it, how we go about studying it. And we know from our own Buddhist practices that although mindfulness is an essential tool, that the goal of meditation is actually equanimity. And there's similarities, but there's also differences. And as we were talking, we realized that part of the problem is that the current definition of mindfulness that everyone uses actually conflates the two concepts a little bit. The definition that most people use of mindfulness was written by John Kabat-Zinn, and he says now that when he wrote this, he never meant for this to be the definition. It's just he was sort of defining it in a very loose way. The way he defined it is paying attention in the present moment with awareness and non-judgmentally. And the first parts of that, which is paying attention to the present moment with awareness, that's all fine. And that jives with the Buddhist idea of mindfulness. But that last part, the non judgmentally, that is not really part of the Buddhist concept of mindfulness. And so the non judgmentally is sort of more part of the equanimity. And again, it's hard to sort of distinguish them, but there's this idea that there's their awareness and then there's sort of the reactivity to what you're being aware of. And so we felt it's important as scientists to make that distinction, to be aware of that distinction more clearly. And we also thought it'd be useful to just get the concept of equanimity into the scientific discussion, because really that's what a lot of scientists are really talking about when they're talking about emotion regulation and all these other things.
And I like the way you characterize that there is this practice, mindfulness, what we do, and that what we often see as that without awareness is more of a result in other contexts, and that's the equanimity piece.
Right.
Dave, how about you? What was it that appealed to you about participating in writing this paper on equanimity?
I guess it really goes back to just creating this wonderful group of scientists in the Boston area was a primary goal for us. And because we were all very close to each other geographically, it just made sense to get together and have more deep discussions about some of these concepts so we can inform the science that we're doing and really collaborate in a way that makes sense to move the field forward in a very convivial way, like we're all contributing to the field. And so that was the initial sort of spark that led to the dialogue. And I like John's definition of mindfulness. It's been a really helpful definition in many ways, especially in the context of mindfulness-based stress reduction. But it's problematic in the laboratory setting exactly for the reasons that Sara was saying, that it's conflated with a lot of other concepts like acceptance, awareness, attention, or even emotion regulation. So the first task was to try to deconstruct mindfulness into component parts. And so we wrote a paper actually before this one, specifically doing that. It was published in Perspectives of Psych Science. And it took apart mindfulness into component parts, looking at, well, what's going on exactly while you're doing the practice. And by doing that, it really set the stage for further dialogue and discussion about the mental factors, at least that's the way it's described in the Buddhist literature, that co-arise through these prescribed meditative practices and that are essential for progressing along the Buddhist spiritual path. And mindfulness is only described as one of them. It seems to be a really critical one. Like, it has the quality of monitoring the development and balance of all the other faculties, but it's usually associated also with other faculties like equanimity, especially in the context of maintaining a freedom of desire and discontent, balanced application of effort, the presence of clearly knowing. So there's all these different ways that mindfulness is described to arise with other mental factors. And so not only is it important to understand how the Buddhist literature talks about these forms of mental training with all these different mental factors, but then to sort of deconstruct those into the more psychological cognitive constructs.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And Sara, would you tell us a little bit about some of the co-authors you have here? I'm seeing some very familiar names.
Yes, no, it's a great group, and I think that was part of it, is that we all really like each other. We like working together, and we were trying to find a way to meet and to do something together, and we felt that this was a great first step towards that. So Liz Hoagie was the person who really spearheaded us getting together, and she was our organizer, and she's fantastic. And for your listeners who don't know her, she is a clinical psychiatrist who has done a lot of work on compassion meditation and how compassion meditation influences the various immune and cytokine functions. And then Britta Holzel was another author, and she was a postdoc with me, and now she's a faculty member on her own in Germany. There's Tim Gard, he's a graduate student. He's about to graduate. Gail Desboard, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Mass General, who's doing a lot of work on compassion, more in the Tibetan style than in the Vipassana style. Kathy, oh, of course, Kathy Kerr. She does a lot of work, sensory perception and interoception and embodiment, really. She's at Brown University now.
And lastly, there's one other.
Yes. We can't forget Andy, of course, who is the resident Buddhist scholar at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. Andy is fantastic. He is a long-term Buddhist scholar, and he and I have known each other for many years and have collaborated on many projects. And so we wanted to make sure that what we were saying was accurate from the Buddhist perspective, and so they could really have a good dialogue between science and Buddhism. And so we brought him in, and he really contributed a lot to the first half of the paper, which is really trying to describe the concept of equanimity and differentiate it from mindfulness from a Buddhist perspective. And then the second half of the paper is more psychological. And so it was really important to have Andy's contribution.
Yeah, and his expertise in the field of classic Buddhist literature and education is just magnificent. He's a terrific scholar in that field.
And terrific communicator, too. I mean, he's just always so clear. I love Andy. Yeah.
So let's segue a little bit. We were talking about how we discern between equanimity and mindfulness, and what were some of the things that came up as qualities of each. Dave, were there particular things that you think of to help distinguish between those two?
Yeah, just a quick anecdote of how the question really arose for me was a dialogue that we were having with some scientists and some Rinpoches and some lamas, actually, at the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute. Richard Davidson showed in one of his studies where you had long-term practitioners doing compassion meditation, and they were listening to sounds of people screaming, babies crying, negative emotional stimuli. And they were supposed to have practiced their compassion while listening. And one of the things that happened was that the amygdala, which is a structure in the brain that's typically associated with emotional reactivity. And what you see in these monks is that the amygdala was really high. And if you were to just look at the brain scan as a neuroscientist, you would say, well, this person looks like they may have something like anxiety. And what was interesting is, well, what does this mean? These are supposed to be highly advanced monks, and they're showing high amygdala reactivity. So how do you explain that? And everyone sort of had their two cents about it. And we asked the scientists, and we asked the Rinpoches, and we even asked the Dalai Lama at one point. And the conclusion that came from that was that it must be indicative of some level of equanimity, because there was no associated physiological arousal, mental perturbation, or rumination, or some perseverative emotional response that was clear. All we saw was a highly reactive amygdala to negative sounds. And so that was like the first segue into trying to explore equanimity. But then if you start to really talk about the word upekkha, the Pali word for equanimity, then it gets a little bit more complicated, because there's all these other ways of describing equanimity, say for the Brahma Viharas, which are the sublime states. There's an aspect of equanimity described there in that context. It's also described in the context of 7 factors of enlightenment, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different ways that it's described. So we wanted to at least narrow down one usage of the term, or one application of the term that was a little bit more broad, and that really fit with maybe the idea of non-judgment and acceptance that's typically fused together with the paying attention in a particular way. And so that's when we broke it down and said, okay, well, let's really talk about the way we describe it in the text, and coming from the Buddhist text, also gazing upon or observing without interference. And this even-mindedness in face of any type of emotional valence, not necessarily stay flat in terms of how it reacts, but how it's able to come back very quickly to a baseline. So that curve of how the mind reacts in the context of emotional stimuli is what we were interested in targeting first.
Sara, you have an example of driving that was just perfect for this. Tell us about that.
Right. It's an experience I actually went through. It was a very personal experience, which is that, I'd been practicing meditation for a while and I had become very mindful, or so I thought. I was becoming certainly more aware of my thoughts and my actions. And, a lot of the changes that people said were supposed to be happening were happening. But then I would notice I'd get in the car and I'd be driving and, there's some pretty aggressive drivers here in Boston. And, someone cut in front of me and I'd be swearing and honking and, getting very upset. So this was discouraging to me and very disheartening, because it's like, here it is, I'm meditating, I'm practicing, but then I'm getting very upset. And the whole idea of being a present moment, non-judgmentally, it's like, okay, well, I'm in the present moment, but I don't think I'm not judging. And so I started wondering, I was like, okay, well, so is it really mindfulness? Is it right? How could I really be mindful if I'm being judging and reactive in the whole thing? And so, after talking with some teachers, and I start to understand experientially that there's that difference between that you can be aware that you're angry. That's the presence. So being aware that you're angry, the mindfulness present, but the equanimity is really not. And so for me, that was really helped me understand the distinction between mindfulness and equanimity. And I think it's something that a lot of people go through, because the mindfulness actually develops fairly quickly. I should say the awareness develops really quickly, but the equanimity takes a little bit longer usually for most people to develop. And I think a lot of people get discouraged, right? Because they go through these situations and they think, oh, I can't do this. And, because they become more and more aware of the negative stuff going through them, and they start judging themselves and get discouraged because, they're supposed to be serene and non-judging, and yet here they are, they're judging. So I think it's useful in clinical context as well as scientific context to really understand the difference between the two.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point that many people who start a meditation practice of whatever particular kind they're doing will notice some of the initial gains that we often see. But unfortunately, on the flip side of those gains, some of those are insight and awareness of how we actually are reacting to things. Like when we're driving and someone cuts us off, we have a better practice of mindfulness, or we're more aware of what we're doing, and we notice we're not behaving as well as we should. And I think that's one reason why in the classic literature around these practices, things like equanimity in particular, that one is a later thing that arises, that we do first have these states of piti sukha, this joy and happiness. It's very physically exciting, like you're very thirsty and you see an oasis, and then you get there and there's all the happiness that you're there and you've arrived, and then there's the equanimity that comes after that's calmed down. But there are these different progression levels that you go through, and they're not all quick and easy to get to.
Definitely not. And so that's actually brings up another point, is that word mindfulness has a lot of different understandings and meanings to it, but the word equanimity is also quite complex and needs to be unpacked as well. And we did a little bit of that in the paper. I think any Buddhist scholar is likely going to know that there's a lot more to it, because there's brief moments of equanimity, but our understanding is that for the monks who really practice, who spend years and years and years on retreat, that equanimity becomes really sublime. And so there's states of equanimity, but there's also trait-like equanimity. And those are interrelated and similar, but they're also different. And so even the concept of equanimity, you have to be careful about how you're using it and what context you're using it, because it means different things to different people, even a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, that if you are removed from the stresses that we normally have in a householder's life, we drive into work and we answer to someone else and we have lots of activity going on in our days, versus a different way of living where our practice of meditation and contemplation is really what we do during the bulk of our waking hours. That in itself can have some meaningful changes to how one approaches moment by moment existence. So, Dave, you used the term emotional valence a few minutes ago to describe another concept that we have in Pali, Vedana, or feeling. Are you finding it challenging to be precise in language while trying to preserve meaning?
Yeah, this is always a critical issue for all the scientists who are doing this type of work. In terms of the language, The way this works is that any scientist who's doing contemplative science has to be a practitioner. And that provides the sort of second person perspective. As scientists, we're used to having a third person approach to looking at things, and that, you put somebody in an experiment, you manipulate a few of the variables, and you make your observations in supposed to be a non-biased way, and you report those particular findings. What the problem with that in doing this type of work is, if you had no insight into how these practices work, it really takes away from the authenticity of the practice itself, from the practices from which these originate. These are pretty complex practices. It's not necessarily as simple as just sitting and following the breath for 20 minutes and then you've experienced mindfulness. Now, that's not to disparage all the people who are trying to look at very short-term forms of practice and the effects that they may have on the mind, the brain, the body. But there is a little bit of a polarization between this new wave of, or third wave forms of psychotherapy, for example, that incorporate what most people are calling mindfulness into a particular paradigm, like, say, acceptance and commitment therapy. And I'll come back to the valence, I promise.
Take your time.
But the idea here really is, I'm really trying to get at the problems with language. And when we talk about mindfulness, then just because they're doing a focused attention practice for 20 minutes, is that really capturing all the other mental factors that are supposed to co-arise with this discriminative attentional capacity that may be the state of mindfulness, the state of being aware in the present moment? Maybe, maybe not. There are people who are measuring trait mindfulness as we define trait mindfulness in the field. We have 8 different measures to measure mindfulness, and a lot of the times they don't even correlate with each other, these measures. That's problematic, right? So here's one of the big questions with language is, can you have mindfulness without ever having practiced meditation? That's a huge question. I think it's a very huge question, and you'll hear people on both sides of the fence arguing about it. And so there's a big language question. So going back to your original question, specifically about Vedana and emotional valence, I think there's still a problem there as well. I remember being actually in Dharamsala at a Mind and Life conference, and there was this discussion about emotion and what was meant by that, and what was meant by feeling, or just the sensory aspects of emotion. And so we're pointing out one of the real issues. And again, language in this context is very difficult, but it takes a practitioner to sort of understand what we're trying to pick apart. Without that insight, you really lose some of the, I call it authenticity, but it's really just a second person perspective into what we're really getting at, and the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral valence of the object of, say, our anger that somebody cut us off on Starro Drive is very subtle. And using our scientific hat, we can also say, well, there's an automatic form of valence that we attribute to an object that could happen below conscious awareness. And we don't talk about that very often, but it's there, and it's something we can measure. And as a scientist, you can think about that. And there's, aspects of the Pali Canon that specifically talks about the sort of immediate contact, or how Vedana sort of is formed in contact with an object of attention. And then there's later evaluations, which are more cognitive in nature, that you're evaluating an object, saying, do I like this? Do I not like it? Is it something I want? Is it something I don't want? That sort of valence, it's similar, but it's quite different. So
it's a mental formation about your feeling.
Exactly. So it's a great question. And I think we are grappling with these terms. And I think it takes people like ourselves, like Sara, myself, and a group of us who are practitioners and scientists, to not only talk with each other, but to bring in the contemplative scholars like Andy, to really get a better context in which to translate these terms into psychological and cognitive concepts. So it's a wonderful question, and I don't think there's a real answer for it. I think we just have to grapple with that issue.
You brought up some very interesting things, one of which being that this is something of a paradigm shift away from being reserved and clinical and separate from what you're studying to being a practitioner. And there's a lot of pushback on that we really need to not be practitioners if we're going to be researching it. And my pushback to that is if you're going to be doing research on physics, you do physics. You're embedded in it. You can't not do it. It's the same thing here.
Richie Davidson, he said one thing in response to that argument. It's not like a cardiologist goes out and doesn't exercise and eat right because he knows that that's good for you. And
Right.
that's what he researches. And that's what he knows is good for your heart.
And I think the real issue is not whether you practice or don't practice, it's the objectivity. The implication is that, well, if you practice, you must be a zealot. And so I think the important thing is that you step back and really try to be honest, and to be aware. Again, as Buddhists, I love this, and it's something I really try to be aware of when I write scientific articles. For me, it's a very much a mindfulness practice. It's a mindfulness of mind, and I really try to notice what my emotional tone and what my intention is as I'm typing and writing up my papers, because I notice that my ego is going like, oh yes, we found such and such, and no, this means such and such, and it's like, okay, hold on, let's rewrite this. And you really have to really fight against it. And then I always try to go back and read through it all again and really try to make sure that any hint of zeal is taken out, and it's really just being objective.
That you still have energy and passion about this, but that you do still maintain your boundaries around confirmation bias, and that we have really good controls in place to ensure that we aren't bleeding over our personal thoughts into the results.
And definitely alternative explanations and alternative interpretations. And then I really like working with non-practitioners and showing the data to non-practitioners, because they'll be honest, right? And they tend to be very skeptical.
Yeah,
and so it's
right.
great, to get their feedback. Because sometimes you can be blind to it, even though I go through and try to take it all out, sometimes I miss it, and they'll say, well, you didn't think about blah, blah, blah. And so that's been really, really helpful over the years to be critical and to really seek alternative, and not just to say, oh, no, you're wrong, you don't understand, but to really say, okay, yeah, this could be a different alternative explanation.
Yeah, one of the most important things that you're bringing up is how helpful critical thinking skills are, because one of the first components in critical thinking is to adjust for your own perspective, because we do have that, and it would be silly to ignore that we do have that. And a healthy dose of skepticism. It doesn't mean denialism. It does mean that we look at things for what they're telling us, for what the data says, rather than building into it our default explanation of what we're seeing. I think that's very helpful, particularly doing scientific studies. And one of the things I did want to ask is this paper that you've written, how might this impact the scientific study of contemplative practices? Dave, what are your thoughts on what you'd like to see with this?
It's a continuation of the sort of mission that we've taken upon ourselves, is to deconstruct some of these Buddhist terms that are supposed to arise together, that co-arise through the prescribed meditative practices. And these are all the things that arise that are essential for progressing along the Buddhist spiritual path. But at the same time, let's go back to John's definition again and remind ourselves and the listeners that he originally intended the word mindfulness to be a placeholder term for the entire Dharma. So using that framework, we now have this 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program that has been proliferated throughout all of society, and that has also been somewhat diluted, to be honest, into various contexts, whether it's mindful parenting, mindful music, mindful cleaning, mindful reading, whatever you want, whatever verb you want, you just add mindful on.
Zen and the art of fill in the blank.
Right, exactly. So it's everywhere. And it's important for us as the scientists in the field to help clarify what we mean by these concepts, mindfulness just being one of them. And I think this paper is one of the first papers to sort of start looking beyond just the concept of mindfulness and to start thinking about all the other mental factors that are supposed to co-arise with mindfulness as a state. So if John uses the word mindfulness really as a placeholder term for the entire Dharma, well, we can think of mindfulness as just sort of a broad term that encompasses, I like to just put it into more everyday secular terms and say mindfulness can be broadly defined as a way of sustaining a healthy mind and reducing biases related to self-processing. But then underneath that umbrella term that we're using, then we can start to pick it apart and say, okay, well, there is a state of mindful awareness that can be separated from equanimity, from balanced application of effort, the equanimous state of concentration or equanimity that's inherent in the freedom from desire and discontent and levels of clarity, and how all these factors may co-arise together and how they may arise in different trajectories. So I'm coming back to what Sara was talking about earlier. What we're realizing is that there's different trajectories for some of these constructs to arise as you move from a novice to an expert practitioner. And that's another sort of aspect of the framework that we're looking at that is critical to examining, because what we're realizing is, yes, mindfulness may arise earlier than equanimity. And then there may be some sort of temporal component in which we can say, okay, mindfulness just arose, and now here's equanimity. And then how does that change throughout the practice as you become more advanced? Does equanimity stay the same? Does mindfulness stay the same? Does it affect these sort of neural networks in the same way? And that's what we're exploring. And that's what I really hope that this paper and many papers to come, hopefully, we can continue creating these forays into the Buddhist literature and then trying to draw out the terms and concepts into more psychological and cognitive concepts that we can study much more effectively in the laboratory setting.
Yeah, I would suggest that one of the things that we as practitioners need to be mindful of, if you forgive my use of the term on that, is that we're not taking the constructs we know from the tradition so very well and simply putting scientific words on top of them, but rather our research is intended to show if we do these things, what happens? Does that happen to match what we're seeing in traditional literature or not? And also being fully aware of that so we don't see a file drawer effect of, oh, we didn't see this, so we're going to disregard the results.
I'll add one thing to that, is that one of the goals or dream scenarios for me is that down the line, as we continue this science, that we'll develop a more comprehensive model, neurobiologically speaking, and physiologically and psychologically, to get these sort of psychosocial biological markers. In essence, we're creating a map, not necessarily for the practitioner to guide themselves and see where they're at, to say, oh, well, I think I've reached the stage of equanimity because my amygdala now responds maximally to this stimulus. I know now that I have equanimity, but more so to help us identify these markers, and it could help actually guide the practitioner in a way that's more responsible. And also it helps develop therapeutic targets in neuropsychiatry, because these are the same mechanisms that are disturbed in people with psychopathology. So I think what we're really doing is identifying a flourishing mind, or the markers for a flourishing mind. And we can then use those targets for people who have psychopathology.
Sara, how about for you? Out of this paper, what are some things that you would like to see? What's your dream scenario?
I think one of the things that really I most wanted to get out of this paper was to bring more of the Buddhist language and philosophy into the discussion. Because I think I saw a lot of psychologists who, they practice meditation, but they don't necessarily know, they haven't necessarily done a lot of study of Buddhist psychology or Buddhist philosophy. And they're trying to define these terms, and they're coming up with all these psychological terms. And for me, there's a little bit of a frustration because, what I love about Buddhism is the precision. He has very clearly defined there's, this many of this mental states, and it's really clearly defined and labeled and defined the different mental states. And then here the psychologists are trying to reinvent the wheel. And it's like, no, let's just go back to the Buddhism and start there and see. For me, I find that the Buddhist philosophy there's a lot of very testable hypotheses in what the Buddha has said. And so why not start there and really start to see, rather than trying to recreate it ourselves and trying to come up with new terminology, let's start there and then as he's defined it and build on that.
Is there anything else that either of you would like to talk about before we break?
No, I think it's been a wonderful time to have this dialogue. I think we're sort of at a point in contemplative science where, like you said, the paradigm is truly shifting, just evidenced by how popular mindfulness is throughout culture. It's important that we have these dialogues between scientists, practitioners, scholars, and that we communicate and talk about how these words can be used in the appropriate settings, and like Sarah's saying, drawing from the Buddhist literature to really get a better sense of what the Buddha really taught.
Well, our guests today have been Dr. Sara Lazar. Sara, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Dave Vago. Dave, thank you for being here.
It was a pleasure.
Today's quote is from Gail DeBoard, Tim Gard, Liz Hoagie, Britta Holtzel, Kathy Kerr, Sara Lazar, Andy Alensky, and David Vago's position paper, Moving Beyond Mindfulness, Defining Equanimity as an Outcome Measure in Meditation and Contemplative Research. If we are mindful while driving, we can direct our attention to what is happening as we drive. Our posture, the speed of the cars around us, pedestrians, etc. We might also be aware of thoughts or emotions that may pass through our mind without getting lost in them. As we drive, we can choose to actively note these events as they pass through our field of awareness. In this case, we are experiencing the flow of sensory and mental objects with an impartial yet caring attitude, equanimity, and mindful awareness. If another driver suddenly cuts in front of us in a dangerous way, we might get scared or angry and yell or honk our horn as we hit the brakes, in which case our mindfulness and equanimity are disrupted by the intrusion of emotions such as anger or fear. Without mindfulness, we do not realize that these emotions are affecting our behavior and mood, causing perhaps road rage or panic. With mindfulness, we might gain awareness that our emotional state has changed, that our voice has gotten louder, that our muscles are more contracted, and that negative thoughts about the other driver are now passing through our mind. Being thus mindful of the arising of anger, we may or may not be able to maintain a state of equanimity and watch the experience of anger unfold and pass on its own accord. In the absence of equanimity, the experience of anger may become overwhelming or persist for a significant amount of time after the situation is over. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.